So there's this doctrine called the Wolfowitz Doctrine. You should know about it. It's very important that you know about it. See, because it's an informal term for a paper that Paul Wolfowitz, some bigwig in Washington back in the day, he's still around. Well, he wrote this paper in '92. Okay. Now, it's very important to understand the moment of 1992. 1992, the Soviet Union had just collapsed and broken up and gone with the wind, right? And the Americans had just finished a Desert Storm, the war with Iraq over Kuwait, and liberated Kuwait, and driven Saddam Hussein back to Baghdad, right? And the United States was feeling, very on top of things. And the Wolfowitz Doctrine emerged. And at this time, of course, this is 30 years ago, the Chinese had not emerged as this global economic power that they are today. I mean, you do keep in mind, 1992 was barely 3 years after Tiananmen Square. Okay, China was still backward. You look at a picture of Shanghai back in 1992, and it's flat. It's flat. Oh shit! Sorry about that. Hang on, I'll be right back. These goddamn air raid sirens, they're going on all the time, and they're just so goddamn annoying because they don't really mean anything. Anyway, the point. You look at a picture of Shanghai back in 1992, and there's no buildings. None of the big, beautiful skyscrapers that there are today. On the contrary, it looks like a little fishing village, right? Shanghai, man. But anyway, the Wolfowitz Doctrine emerged, and it caused all kinds of consternation. I do recall, if memory serves, that it came out in March of '92. It was leaked to the New York Times, caused all kinds of outrage. And the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, at the time, later Vice President Cheney, he toned it down, and they rewrote it, and kind of brought the whole thing a little bit down, lowered the volume on the whole situation. But you got to understand that the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the paper that Wolfowitz wrote, is basically still dictating American policy. And in order to understand what is coming up, in order to understand the world war that we are currently in, because we are in a world war, we just haven't defined it as such, but it is. To understand the world war that we are currently in and understand how it's going to get shitloads worse, we have to understand the Wolfowitz Doctrine, and we have to understand two things. Number one, that the American government and all the people running the American government bought into it wholesale. They believe it. And number two, the Wolfowitz Doctrine inevitably leads to a world war. Inevitably. Okay? Now, what is the Wolfowitz Doctrine? Well, it's basically 6 points. 6 points that matter. Okay, the first one is that the United States should strive to maintain its superpower status no matter what. It must always have a very, very powerful military, because military force is the only force that truly matters, which is correct. Okay, you can be as rich as Croesus, right? But if you don't have the muscle, anybody can come around and just take it away from you. See, that's why military muscle, military power is the only real power. And to have military power, you need economic power, of course. And to have economic power, you have to have a very unified and consolidated population. I mean, you see how the causal ladder works, right? So the first principle of the Wolfowitz Doctrine is the U.S. has to maintain superpower status. The second is that the United States has to maintain U.S. primacy. It has to be the superpower, and better yet, the only superpower. And this is the key issue. You see, in 1992, the United States was the only superpower because the other superpower had gone tits up. So the United States, with the Wolfowitz Doctrine, insisted that what it had to do is maintain not only its superpower status, but maintain global primacy, the unipolar world. The U.S. had to be the number one power indisputably. Okay? Now, right there, you can see how dangerous this is. Okay, that was the second out of the 6 principles of the Wolfowitz Doctrine. The third was unilateralism, that the United States had the right, okay? I mean, this is a crazy part. The United States had the right to just, do whatever it wanted unilaterally. It didn't need allies. As a practical matter, this is true. The United States was and is, so far, powerful enough that it can go alone in any particular adventure that it wants. Sure. As a practical matter, is it a wise way to go about things? No, it's not. I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush, right? He went to war over Iraq, but he was very smart about it. He assembled an international coalition with a whole bunch of nations, most of which, if not all of which, didn't contribute much militarily. But the fact that he brought all these nations together to get with the United States in order to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait lent the whole adventure a moral credibility that it would have lacked. You see? Because all of these nations, and many of them in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Syria and Israel and all these countries, they were all in the same boat. All united with the common objective of expelling Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And because of it, even though these little nations didn't add anything of any real value, militarily speaking, it gave a moral weight to the political decision. And so everybody was on board. See? And that's why the notion of unilateralism, that the United States can go it alone, doesn't need any allies, it's very, very dangerous. And that was the third issue. Now, the fourth issue was preventive intervention, that the United States had the right, again, the right, and think of the language of that. The United States has the right to intervene preventively. Now, what does that mean, preventive intervention, to intervene preventively? Well, it basically means that we can go in and invade a country just because we think that you're dangerous. It was the justification for the Iraq War. I mean, they tried to gussy it up with the weapons of mass destruction, right? They tried to create a lie that would give them moral justification for the invasion. But basically, the invasion of 2003 was just a preventive intervention. The notion that, Saddam Hussein, who's on the other side of the world, might present a problem, might present a threat to the United States, so we have the right to invade it, and nobody can tell us otherwise. I mean, think how arrogant that is, but that was part of it. The fifth issue was the Russian threat, that Russia should never be allowed to become a military threat again to the United States. And that made a lot of sense because at the time, Russia had 6,000 nuclear weapons, still does, see? And the Americans had had the Cold War with the Russians for 45, 46 years at that time, right? So it made sense to emphasize Russia. But the notion is very interesting that the Wolfowitz Doctrine, because it wasn't just Paul Wolfowitz who wrote it, it was a whole coterie of neoliberals, most of whom are still around in power, in positions of power in Washington today. Well, this whole coterie, they were looking at Russia as an existential threat forever, that there would never be a moment when Russia was not a potential threat, and that therefore Russia should be kept down no matter what. Now, that's very interesting. And because also it explains certain far out and ridiculous notions, like, for instance, the notion that Russia should be broken up into smaller countries. And that's crazy. You can't really do that. Russia has always been a unified country, always in the sense of like the last 600 years, right? I mean, Russia is a country that you don't just break it up lickety-split. It's not Yugoslavia, for crying out loud, okay? But that was part of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, as enumerated by Paul Wolfowitz in 1992, was the justification for a lot of the efforts at regime change in Russia and breaking up Russia, which are in the plans of various think tanks, mainstream think tanks like the Rand Corporation and the Brookings Institute. These people wanting to break up Russia, they view Russia as an existential threat, as a perma-threat. You see? No matter what Russia does, these people will always think that Russia has to be ground down and broken up. I mean, frankly, from what you read of not only Wolfowitz, but other of these people, you realize that what they'd really, really like is just to glass all of Russia, just annihilate it with nuclear weapons. That's what they really like, but they don't think they can get away with it. And that's the truth. I mean, if we're doing it, hand to heart, what do they really, really want? That's what they really want, okay? I mean, nobody said that these people were good. Quite the contrary. These people are fucking evil as far as I'm concerned, but that's not the issue. The issue is, what was the sixth point? The sixth point, man, I'm sounding like Cernovich. The sixth point was that the Wolfowitz Doctrine insisted that The Middle East and Southeast Asia had to, Southwest Asia, had to be permanently in chaos. Why? Because that's where the oil is. If you keep these regions in permanent chaos, then you can get the oil, get the resources, and there will never be a political entity that can challenge your desire for these resources, that can get fair pricing for these resources. Because you have to keep in mind, the oil that the Americans are stealing in Syria, that they have stolen in Iraq, all the mineral resources from Afghanistan that they took during their 20-year occupation, all this stuff, see, it's extractive, resource extraction, and it's always screwing over the local people. That's the aim of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, to keep America number one, and to keep America with the possibility, with the open door, to invade any country that it wants to, break up any country that it wants to, extract all the resources from any country that it wants to. Basically, it is a doctrine that says that morality and decency need not apply to American actions. That America can act as the most tyrannical and despicable nation in history by way of its military force. And see, you can obviously tell that most of the rest of the world doesn't like this. Yeah, of course not. And so what's happened is that as Russia's military power has grown, its economic power has grown, as it's basically reestablished itself as the great power that it is, as that's grown, that's made the Americans very nervous, but China freaks them out. Because back in 1992, nobody expected the Chinese economy to surpass the American economy, not in the next century. But here we are, less than 30 years after the Wolfowitz memo, and China is most definitely a bigger economy than the United States. In terms of purchasing power parity, it is. In nominal terms, it will be in like a couple of years. I think it's 2027 in nominal terms. But like I said, what really matters is the purchasing power parity. And in that measure, China passed the United States 3-4 years ago, I think. And if you look at other metrics, the famous Big Mac metric of The Economist magazine, look it up, it's really interesting. Well, see, if you look at them from those metrics, the Chinese economy passed the American economy back in 2010, okay? So you see how all of these neocons, these crazy people in Washington who have signed on to the Wolfowitz Doctrine, how they're terrified now. And they do not want this multipolar world that is emerging. This multipolar world that is emerging naturally. Because what has happened is twofold. Number one, these economies, the Russian economy, the Indian economy, the Chinese economy, the Iranian economy, and the economies in Latin America, they've grown. They've grown quite a bit. And they've become much more powerful because of it. And because they've become more powerful economies, they have the money for bigger militaries. They are becoming regional powers on the one hand. So these powers have grown, and America's power has diminished because of a whole host of terrible decisions. Terrible decisions, financial crises that were not managed properly, all kinds of bullshit. Industrial policy that hollowed out the American industrial base and has turned the American economy into a service-oriented economy, which is nothing. It's fluff. It's bullshit. And that's what's going on. And so the people who are in power in the United States are realizing this, and they're terrified. They're seeing that American power compared to the rest of the world is slipping radically, drastically, and very, very quickly. And so they're lashing out. And the Wolfowitz Doctrine is driving us into this Third World War. This Third World War that is already in progress. That's what's going on.